Top of the morning to you laddies, my name's Kohaku Gaming Eye, the only channel on the internet that makes videos. That was dog shit. I wanted to follow up my Heisei ranking video. I did some digging, I did some calculating, and let's just say there is more to SpaceGodzilla than meets the eye. Alright. But before we jump into all this, the Kohaku Gaming test audiences deemed today's video, quote, too experimental. I don't see it, but hey, I just make the videos. I'm just gonna make some quick adjustments here, and some quick adjustments here, and done. Enjoy the rest of the video. In order to really make things clear, first I want to really lay out everything that I glossed over in my last video. Firstly, Godzilla is intelligent, but he is just an irradiated dinosaur. During the plot of Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, we find out that Godzilla is a mutated Godzillasaurus from Lagos Island, mutated by the Castle Bravo hydrogen bomb tests in 1954. During the events of the film, however, the dudes from the future TP the Godzillasaurus away and put him in the Bering Sea, hoping to stop him from existing in the first place. However, as they say in the film, the second birth of Godzilla was an unavoidable event, and another Godzilla is created in the Bering Sea. I think this is to say that Godzilla's birth was rather destined to happen. There is an important key to this puzzle that isn't necessarily obvious at first, but when you really investigate how time works in the Heisei films, we realize that the universe seems to correct itself onto a single path. Let me explain. Chronologically, Godzilla's birth happens first, then the return of Godzilla, then Biollante, and then Ghidorah. Any normal time travel movie would have explained their time fuckery, but they don't. So it's up to us to guess and figure it out. Under normal circumstances, it would make the most sense when the Dorats replace Godzilla and Godzilla is sent out to sea for a new universe or a parallel universe to be created, or even for the present to simply be changed according to their actions. But this is not the case. The main group returned to the completely unchanged present. Why? I don't know. It's absolutely confounding that Ghidorah did nothing until they returned to the present. They went back in time and made it so Ghidorah had always existed. They replaced Godzilla with Ghidorah, a much more destructive monster. Simultaneously though, Godzilla 2 is also created. This should mean that things in the past would have played out differently, but that isn't the case. It seems that time is convoluted in these lands. Despite the origin point changing, the events of history have remained static. Nothing has truly changed, but is this the same Godzilla? The film never questions this, or even brings it up, but the lying fucking future guys do claim that the OG Godzilla has disappeared from history. We know from SpaceGodzilla that despite the Futurians meddling, the events of 84, Biollante, and the first half an hour of Ghidorah do still happen, so the events of the time in between the past and the present are completely unchanged. This means that 84 Goji did still exist in the timeline, and had to have been completely erased from time in the present. One critical detail is at the beginning of the film, it is clearly established by our trustworthy Miki Sagusa that Godzilla was driven to the Sea of Japan by Biollante, where he's been resting alive and unabated by the nuclear bacteria. Tell me why the movie goes out of its way to not only tell us where Godzilla is resting, but to tell us that the UFO containing the Futurians visited exactly where Godzilla was located in the Sea of Japan. We do not see Godzilla at all from the beginning of the movie to this point until after they go to the past and move the Godzillasaurus. In fact, Godzilla seems to be completely gone from the two satellite images that Mickey shows us. Listen, what the fuck did they do to Godzilla? After they visit Godzilla, they go to Mount Fuji, they don't return to the future with any data, we don't see if Godzilla is safe or even alive at all. In fact, like I mentioned, bro is nowhere to be found until after the time travel shenanigans, and the Futurians played off like nothing happened. The government is fully aware that the UFO affected Godzilla in some way, or at least visited him, but they just seem to shrug it off, even after making the comment that they have become one body. Weird. The girl from the future, despite becoming an ally to the present main character, never really reveals all of her information. The trip back to the past includes 3 people from the present, and the thing is, they don't actually do anything on their time travel trip. They are seemingly brought along to verify the Godzillasaurus's teleportation, but why did the Futurians choose these 3 people instead of, I don't know, the actual government? The Prime Minister? Anybody? Their choice of people is Terasawa, the main character, and author of the Godzilla origin book, his associate, Hironori Mizaki, who also contributed to the book, and Miki Saigusa. This is no coincidence. In fact, I think that the only reason they were brought along was so that the Futurians could get away with their plans. Consider this. The authors of the book go in the time machine and return to the present as the same people, meaning they are the original versions of themselves from the timeline where Godzilla 1 was the only Godzilla, meaning that tangibly, the book can still exist. Even if they don't write it in this timeline, it can still exist because it is connected to the future of these 2 individuals, even if the timeline that they return to has changed. As for Miki, it's obvious she had to go so she could not detect and reveal that Godzilla had already been tampered with by the Futurian. It's established early on she is tracking Godzilla, and due to her ESP, she can locate him fairly simply. The time between the Futurians visiting Godzilla, their contact with the people of 1992, and their foray into the past, there was never a moment where Miki was able to verify Godzilla's presence again. And if she were waiting in the present for the moment that Godzilla was supposed to have disappeared, she would have realized he was already gone before their time travel business was even done. They arrive at the past, 28 minutes and 37 seconds into the movie, to the year 1944, February 14th, with their destination back being 1992, July 6th at 1500 or 3 o'clock. From the start of the film, the UFO arrives at night, and then it cuts to morning, then to night, then to the scene where they reveal the UFO's flight path, and we get a concrete date, 1992, July 2nd. It then cuts to morning. It cuts to another scene where it is still light outside, presumably midday. It then cuts to night, and again to morning, and to what I assume is midday, where the Futurians make their first contact with Japan. It cuts again to a daytime scene where the Futurians talk with the Prime Minister. It cuts to our main character eating some mayonnaise sauce dinosaur yakisoba, and then to a night scene. Then after their conversation, it cuts to morning, where they then leave for the past. Our timeline events presumably look like this, giving them only 3 full days between Godzilla's last sight and the events of the time travel. The scenes actually line up exactly with the dates presented. So despite the complete travesty of the time travel plot, they did care about the day-to-day consistency of this film, for whatever that's worth. When they arrive back in the present, the Futurian says that Fujio was in contact with them, and the Japanese Naval Observation Post reported right away. But we have no fucking evidence to believe that this is accurate timing, nor can we actually trust the Futurians at their word. It is true that Godzilla has disappeared, but I think it's perfectly reasonable to suspect that the Futurians have already tampered with Godzilla from the present. According to the timetables, they leave on the morning of the 6th and come back around 3 p.m. Fujio is initially present when the group leaves, which means he only was observing Godzilla for a few hours after they had already left. At which point they're like, "Oh my gosh, Godzilla's gone!" But my game theory? Godzilla was already gone. I don't think Godzilla was actually erased from existence, and so this is why I think that the Futurians teleported 84 Godzilla into space, and that he is actually the true origin for SpaceGodzilla. Your next question is, why then would they still go back in time and replace the Godzillasaurus with the Dorats? Well, that's simple. Just look at the way they talk about this Godzilla. They don't say anything implying that the first one never happened, because as we've established, you can't actually change the events of the past. That first Godzilla would have continued to exist regardless, and if they had sent him to space and nothing else, eventually he would have returned as SpaceGodzilla regardless. And without another Goji or Ghidorah to defeat him, SpaceGodzilla would have destroyed Earth. I believe that their time travel was done not just to make Ghidorah, but to replace Godzilla. Miss What's-Her-Name is an ally to Japan, and she was the one that let the fucking Dorats out in the first place. So I think that when they teleported the Godzilla star away, they had hoped that Ghidorah would simply become Godzilla, and they would be able to mind control him and replace him in the events of history. This didn't happen. It's why they refer to this as the second birth of Godzilla, or they refer to him as another Godzilla. This is clearly not the same Godzilla, even though it originates from the same Godzillasaurus, and despite their claims that he disappeared, we don't see the original Goji ever again, nor do we see his disappearance. Unless you want to subscribe to my infinitely cooler Space Godzilla theory, except it is the second birth of Godzilla that is unavoidable, potentially meaning that they have done this before and the outcome has always been another Godzilla being born, but where does that leave us exactly? Events seem to play out normally for the rest of the Heisei era. No more time-related shenanigans, right? Except this is not the case. The future that the Futurians are coming from is very clearly permeable. Japan goes from being the most powerful country in the world to being a small baby country. If we can even trust these as facts. But the events of the Heisei films don't change by their meddling, other than what they actually technically did, and you could argue that if Godzilla's second birth is said to be an unavoidable event, so too was Ghidorah and Space Godzilla, which are the only things we can truly tie to the Futurians. My real theory is that the events of the Heisei era are recursive. I believe Godzilla is stuck in a time loop and cognizant of what is going on, and that possibly burning Godzilla has ended the world many times before, and every time it does end, it resets. It's a hard sell, I know, but think about the current Heisei timeline. Let's just ask ourselves, what would it look like had the Futurians not involved themselves? Initially, you might think that due to the nature of this world, things would play out quite similarly. However, I don't think this is the case. Ghidorah is an artificial animal in this series, made by the Futurians, so he cannot exist in the past. Mechagodzilla 2, as well, is based off of Mechaghidorah's head. In this timeline, that doesn't happen. In this timeline, Godzilla most likely stays completely dormant due to the anti-nuclear bacteria developed in Biollante. So no Mothra. Now, where does that leave Space Godzilla? Space Godzilla is said to either be spores from Biollante or cells, or Godzilla cells, that fell off of Mothra when she went to space. I think Space Godzilla is the original Godzilla of the Heisei era, and not actually just some stupid Biollante cells or Godzilla cells that fell off of Mothra. Like, come on. A much more plausible theory, in my opinion, is that Space Godzilla is actually a whole Godzilla mutated, maybe with Biollante cells on him from their fight, if you still want Biollante to be a part of this backstory. The next step of my plan here is to prove that Space Godzilla doesn't exist in the Futurians' unaltered timeline. In the film, they propose two possibilities. One, that Mothra could have dropped some G cells when she was hanging out in space, or two, it was Biollante cells that were hanging out in space and drifted off. Firstly, Mothra, I don't believe this one is the case, because neither Godzilla nor Mothra actually really damage each other in their fight. Apparently, if you kiss someone, their DNA only stays in your mouth for up to 6 hours. And given that Godzilla and Mothra were definitely not making out, him and Batra were though, at best I would say our potential window for G cells getting lost in space is like 12 hours. And that's being generous, because they didn't even draw each other's blood. And when she picked him up, it was by his tail. If that's not enough for you, at the end of the movie, it seems like Mothra uses her scales, or at least a similar ability. The point is, she sheds some weird fucking particles, which is enough evidence for me that there was no way she had Godzilla cells on her when she went to space. The second issue is Biollante. At the end of Godzilla vs. Biollante, Biollante does become a flower that's in Earth's orbit. However, she is still technically in form. And I don't find it plausible that one, she would accidentally shed a random cell, given that she is literally made of spores. Like, how would you lose any? You're just a bunch of sentient air. But two, that it would survive the trip in space because the plant DNA in the Biollante cells is definitely weak to fire and radiation, both of which seem to be pretty common in space. But hey, I'm no expert. This is my real evidence. we get to see what SpaceGodzilla cells look like, Godzilla cells, and we get to see the moment that the crazy guy combines plant cells with Godzilla cells. The plant cell is clearly green. Biolante's fully mutated cells are never seen, but we can pretty much assume that they are green or yellow. SpaceGodzilla cells are almost entirely purple with the exception of these white bits here. Red, green, and blue do make white, but there is very clearly way more red and purple than there is white. If this was a fully mutated Biolante cell, there's no way it could be mostly purple. Not only that, but the same white is present on the normal G cell. The G cell and the SpaceGodzilla cell also appear to be the same size, while the plant cell is noticeably bigger. When they're combined, it gets even bigger. This could just be optical bullshit or whatever, but I find this pretty convincing. But there's more. I want to examine SpaceGodzilla's powers and his abilities, and his design. Kevin Spacey has the normal Godzilla variant powers, such as insane strength, a beam attack, and incredible durability / healing. He also has a crystal shield known as a photon reactive shield. I don't really understand what a photon is, but according to Google, it is the smallest possible packet of electromagnetic energy. I guess it makes sense, since bro got shoved into a black hole. Similar to Destroya, SpaceGodzilla has a specific flying form that is apparently the heaviest kaiju in the verse, which is interesting. But perhaps even more interesting is the fact that he can get to the speed of light in space. Okay. He has a few different forms of telekinesis and energy manipulation, but the most important ability here is the gravity tornado. Despite sounding like some crazy fucking roller coaster, it's actually a telekinesis power that allows him to move kaiju around. He does this not just to Junior, but to Godzilla as well. And this is where an insane key difference between the original Godzilla / SpaceGodzilla comes into play. In Godzilla vs. Biolante, Miki Sagusa is presumably at, or very close to the peak of her power. She attempts to stop Godzilla by using her psychic powers. Godzilla is not just able to resist, but to incapacitate Miki. However, in SpaceGodzilla, we see two things. One, Godzilla is able to be controlled / suggested. The humans do put an amplifier on the back of his head. But two, Godzilla is unable to resist any of SpaceGodzilla's psychic manipulation. The wiki doesn't even mention Godzilla on the telekinesis page. However, the same wiki also states this. The military is sent out to meet Godzilla at Ise Bay. However, Godzilla unexpectedly surfaces in Osaka Bay. Avoiding a confrontation with the JSDF, Miki tries to help, attempting to make Godzilla turn away from Osaka using her psychic abilities. Her efforts distracted Godzilla momentarily, but the force of Godzilla's will and his psychic brain power overwhelms her, causing her to faint. Psychic brain power, huh? Despite not having abilities, it is clear that in this film, Godzilla is not at all powerless against the psychic powers. Unlike his counterpart in SpaceGodzilla, Godzilla does regain control of his mind from the humans, but I honestly think this was only because this guy is a complete moron and completely fucks the entire thing up. To be honest, I don't want to think about the actual plot of SpaceGodzilla. It's so fucking trash. But for me, this is just another indication that something is slightly off between these Godzillas. The Godzilla in SpaceGodzilla should not only be more powerful, but arguably should have a stronger will, because he's the only one that can protect Junior. However, through a little ass satellite, they are able to control him, although temporarily. As for Miki, in Godzilla vs. Destroya, she says that her ESP powers are getting weaker. But in SpaceGodzilla, we see her lift a bed with her mind. This is the only actual instance where she does anything like this. So it's hard to say where her power level really was at around this time. It's difficult to power scale mind powers, however Godzilla is controlled twice in this movie and thrown around by SpaceGodzilla's mind. But in the next film, they don't even consider mind controlling him. This movie takes place in 1995 and vs. Destroya takes place in 96, only a year later. So while it's possible, I find it unlikely that Miki is at the peak of her power in 1995. However, at the same time, she was able to do something that she had previously never been shown capable of doing. So I would probably say that 1995 SpaceGodzilla is Miki Sagusa at probably 80% power. I think it's probably a pretty easy thing to say that without the intervention of the Futurians, burning Godzilla never happens. It's speculated that what really triggered burning Godzilla was the explosion on Bass Island. If he was was never there, there is no burning Godzilla. In the Futurians' original future, Japan is a massive global superpower that literally buys countries. It's safe to say that this normal timeline had to have happened at least once due to the nature of time travel, especially in this case, where they seriously fucked some shit up. And given that before the point of Versus Ghidorah, events were playing out normally, as if Godzilla was born from the atomic test on Lagos Island, and there was no Ghidorah, and there was no Dora. Other evidence for this is the book that the protagonist writes about the origins of Godzilla. Even when the original Godzilla is, quote, erased from fucking history, this book is not erased, meaning that it is not a tangible object of this timeline, but rather a relic of an old, unchanged timeline. And due to the lack of serious stress, I think Godzilla in the original timeline is probably just chilling, or they just kill him, but it is instead the actions of the Futurians that directly causes burning Godzilla to happen by creating the second Godzilla and the events of the remainder of the Heisei era. But as we know, events that have happened will always happen, which means that the Futurian future has to exist. Even if they somehow change it, it has to exist. The Futurians must always exist. This is not necessarily definitive proof, and my house is basically entirely speculation at this point, but what if Godzilla did go supernova and exploded and destroyed the Earth? This would create a time paradox, where because the Futurians never existed, they never went back in time to create the second Godzilla. And it's not like the second Godzilla can really happen if the first one actually did. And I don't believe one word out of their lying whore mouths, but if you want to believe what the liars from the future say, go ahead. The important thing here is Godzilla's actual death. My game theory is that Godzilla is like the universe's load-bearing coconut. To run back over everything, I think that in Versus Ghidorah, the Futurians do not erase Godzilla from time, but rather they teleport him into space, and their actions in the past do not erase Godzilla, but their goal was to simply replace him with Ghidorah. And the original Heisei Godzilla is actually the true origin of Space Godzilla. But another Godzilla is born anyway, leading to the timeline getting really messed up, leading to the eventual meltdown of burning Godzilla. I presume that the humans were not always successful in defeating burning Godzilla, and perhaps in some timelines Destroyer was never found. And when he melts down and destroys Earth, this causes a time paradox, which sets the universe back to its original state, either to the timeline where the Futurians are yet to go back in time, or back to when the second Heisei Godzilla is born. There are definitely plenty of holes in my theory, especially the time loop part, because we never actually see the humans fail to stop burning Godzilla's meltdown or explosion, but I do genuinely stand behind all this, and I think that the Futurians creating Space Godzilla makes so much more sense than some half-assed explanation about a single skin cell falling off of Mothra. But hey, that's just a theory. A game theory! Thanks for watching.